Being in Brazil right now for an American is like being in an alternative universe in which the president of the country plots to overthrow a lawful election, and rather than winding up back in power, winds up on trial for that attempt. That's what's happening right now. So I'm going to walk you through a little history. Bear with me, it's a little complicated, but it's worth it because it shows us how differently things could have gone in the United States, because that's what's happening here in Brazil. So Jair Bolsonaro, former president of the nation, is on trial right now for a coup. That's what they're calling it. Not a protest, not even an insurrection. They're calling it a coup attempt. He's the first president to be brought up on these charges since Brazil emerged from a military dictatorship in 1985. And his trial starts right now with 80 witnesses lined up to testify that he knew about, and in some cases even plotted, the overthrow of a duly elected government. So back in October of 2022, Ignacio Lula da Silva, the current president of Brazil, was elected and defeated Jair Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro's he's a Trump guy. He's a big enthusiast of Trump. He ran on a sort of populist message like Trump did, and in many ways seems to have taken some of his tactics, his choreography from Trump, considering the success that Trump has had. And in doing so, it's really, I mean, it's uncanny just how similar things are. During COVID, under Bolsonaro, there was incredible misinformation about COVID, spread mostly by Bolsonaro, and huge numbers of people amplifying it online. So much so that Brazil had one of the highest, had just an incredible death rate, terrible, terrible death rate. And that machinery continued as journalists began to turn up evidence of Bolsonaro possibly enriching himself and his family through his office. That sounds familiar. Those sorts of investigations were met with incredible disinformation campaigns by organized groups online, amplifying all sorts of conspiracy theories and stuff against journalists, against investigators, against the federal judge, Alexandre de Moraes, who's one of the big figures in this. I'm going to come to him more in a moment. And it got so bad that Moraes, this federal judge, actually insisted that Elon Musk bring X to heel. He canceled a bunch of accounts and insisted that they do a better job of fighting misinformation. But Musk more or less ignored him until finally Moraes banned X in this country because of the misinformation problem, and even looked at the possibility of changing some political outcomes based on the incredible amount of misinformation that was out there. It was, I mean, if you can imagine, right, in the United States, if the Supreme Court suddenly said, we're going to shut X down because it is such a source of misinformation. And eventually Elon Musk did sort of accept what the judge Moraes told him to do, and today X is much more tightly controlled than it was. So once Lula da Silva won in October 2022, Bolsonaro went on a big rampage of decrying the election as fraud, describing imaginary plots to hack the system and to that it, somehow, I mean, it's all very similar stuff to what we heard in the United States, that the machines were corrupted and there was an influence campaign and all of this stuff, none of which has been shown to be true. Because here's the other thing about Brazil is, as cartoonish as its misinformation system can be, and it's really crazy, the kinds of like horrific sexual stuff and all kinds of creepy stuff that's brought against journalists and investigators and the rest of it, it's in some ways even worse than it is in the United States. But at the same time, there's a very powerful form of journalism here in which many, many investigative journalists are working all the time. There's a big investigative news agency, a sort of fact-checking news agency that's based here in Rio called Lupa, which stands for the magnifying glass. And, they do all kinds of amazing work fighting that disinformation and misinformation. And then the federal judgeships are very, very powerful here. They have incredible discretion to lead investigations, do all sorts of stuff. And Alexandre de Moraes had done all of that. It all came to a head such that the police filed charges against Bolsonaro in a 900-page document that say that basically he talked in that year between October 22 and then January of 23, talked about laying siege, creating a state of siege, and the idea that basically he would sort of actively work to overthrow Lula da Silva's duly elected government. And in the end, on January 8th, 2023, a year and 2 days after the January 2022, January 6th in the United States, on January 8th, a huge number of supporters of Bolsonaro went ahead and stormed the Capitol. Very, very similar to how it happened here in the United States. And that attack is now the thing being called a coup. So much so that, so not only does Bolsonaro currently face a prohibition on really running for political office again until 2030. He's not allowed to run for office, to stand for office until then. Although he says next year he's going to, in 2026, when national elections happen again, that he is going to stand for the presidency, but he's not allowed to under these court orders. And he's also facing the possibility, if this goes through, of 40 years in prison. That's how much he could be sentenced by. So again, just like consider what it is to be in this country where these circumstances are so similar. You have an elected leader losing an election and then orchestrating a attempt to discredit the election and winds up getting very seriously punished for it. Truly is standing trial now. So his former Army commander and Air Force commander were the first witnesses against him. And the Army commander described being in meetings in which Bolsonaro talked about it openly, about a state of siege and so forth. And the Army commander says, if you do this, you're going to get into an incredible amount of legal trouble. And he even threatened to arrest him, the president, Bolsonaro, if he were to go forth with this. Those two were the first of 80 witnesses that are going to come up and talk about this. Bolsonaro is on trial, along with 4 of his ministers, his head of intelligence. It's him and 7 people on standing trial. And, you know, the stakes are very, very high for him, not just professionally, but also personally, because back in 2018, a lone knife-wielding person stabbed Bolsonaro in a public event. And Bolsonaro has been undergoing surgery ever since, basically to try and repair damage to his abdomen that resulted from this attack. And so he says that if he were to go to prison right now, he probably would not survive that experience. He's not a young man, but he's not an old man yet. And he's, you know, very plausibly facing the rest of his life in prison if he were to get sentenced in this way. And, you know, the thing that is so amazing being here and seeing this is just, you know, to think about what if these events took place in the United States, right? Because everything leading up to it is so similar. You know, Bolsonaro, who has spent time at Mar-a-Lago, spends a fair amount of time in Florida. Anyway, really, you know, a big fan of Trump, has met with him. You know, is not, you know, he really followed the same choreography as Trump, same kind of speaking points and all that stuff. But now, you know, he's not allowed to say in public anymore that he thinks the election is stolen. Meanwhile, Trump is continuing to do so because here in Brazil, if he does continue to say that, he gets into even deeper legal trouble. And, you know, the big difference here is the power of the federal court, the Supreme Court, in which 5 justices are presiding over what is called the pretrial portion of this case, in which they figure out whether there's enough evidence to go forward, essentially. But those individual justices, one of which is Alexandre de Moraes, who's been this big kind of, I mean, people in the press really talk about him as Bolsonaro's archenemy. They have incredible discretion to put this guy in prison if they find that that's the appropriate thing to do and that the evidence supports it. And so again, it's just, you know, in a world in which you can imagine Bolsonaro looking at Trump and saying, man, if I could just, you know, get back to power, it would all be all right. But he didn't manage to shoot the moon in the way that Trump did. And when you walk around any of these big cities, you see signs up talking about amnesty, because one of the things that's happening right now is that Bolsonaro's allies in the parliament are pushing a bill that would grant amnesty to Bolsonaro and to his supporters who stormed the Capitol. And that amnesty is the subject of posters everywhere that say no amnesty for dictators. There's clear, big support for the idea that he should go to prison, even at the same time as there are supporters of Bolsonaro who show up at rallies for him. 45,000 people showed up to a rally for him. And he just stood just a few days ago on the site of that January 8th attack on the Capitol, dressed in a Brazilian soccer jersey, the ultimate sign of patriotism, talking about how he is innocent and this is all sort of made up. But this is a guy who truly could go to prison for doing, in essence, the exact same thing that our president did. But our guy wound up back in the White House. This guy is looking at possibly 40 years in prison.
Thanks everyone for watching. Your support means the world to us. So make sure you hit the like button and you subscribe to our channel to make sure that you never ever miss a video. We're live every day, 10 a.m. Eastern time. We drop even more content at 2 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Eastern. And if you want more Don Lemon Show content, we'd love for you to become a member of the Lemon community, where you will receive access to special community posts. You'll get exclusive content and members-only live shows. So head over to our channel page or click the join button on this video. Again, thank you for watching. We appreciate your love and your support, and we will see you next time.